And over the last few years, we have expanded to encompass the entire Bay Area. As the focus of today's event is housing in the South Bay, we are especially excited to announce our new South Bay and Peninsula organizer, Alysa. Ali has worked extensively in politics and advocacy across the region, and we're delighted to welcome them to our team. I'm sure many of those in our audience will be hearing from and collaborating with Ali in the near future. I also want to thank our friends and partners who are co-presenting today's program: Silicon Valley at Home, California YIMBY, YIMBY Action, and Greenbelt Alliance. And now for part one of our two-part conversation, I'd like to welcome Assemblymember Alex Lee. Elected in 2020, Assemblymember Lee represents California's 25th Assembly District, which includes Alameda County communities of Fremont and Newark, and the Santa Clara County communities of Milpitas, San Jose, and Santa Clara. He's been a leading proponent of social housing, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, and a strong pro-housing champion overall. Assemblymember Lee, thank you so much for joining us. I'll begin by asking you a few initial questions. And if anyone in the audience has questions as well, please use the webinar Q&A feature to ask them, and we'll try to address them as we have time. So Alex, if it's okay if I call you Alex, just as a first question, to better understand why you got involved in this work, can you start off by sharing how housing has impacted you personally?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I'm very delighted to be on here today with you, Todd, and talking about one of my favorite policy topics is housing. In fact, when I first was elected in 2020 in my kind of against the odds campaign, I made housing a central theme of my policy of the campaign. And, you know, even back then in 2019, the days of SB 50 being the defining question that every candidate gets asked, I remember people thought that having housing as your central issue is like political suicide, because there's so many people who are very invested passionately about housing and have a lot of opinions about it. So people generally try to make housing platforms, from what I've seen in the past, right, quite vague about it. But I was very deliberate about saying, well, we need more and more options to build affordable housing. I was pro SB 50, pro these things, and I have an overwhelming suburban district too, mind you, in the Bay Area. For me, it just felt like common sense, is because I share this a lot, is I am only able to live in my San Jose home in my district because I live with my mom. Just like so many young professionals who do make a decent salary, home ownership or even renting is either financially impractical, highly impractical, or out of reach. In fact, in the single family home neighborhood I live in, the two houses in front of us just went for, I think, according to Zillow at least, like 1.2, and then the other one went for 1.3, probably sold for more, but that was what they're valued on Zillow at. And it's just very impossible to afford it, you know? And this is the struggle of so many people that grew up in the Bay Area, grew up especially in our area, right? Like they go get some really good compensated jobs and they still are like, well, I think maybe I should just live at home, or I'll live with 10 other people in this house, you know? And really the housing crisis, I think, is an acute way which people feel inequality in our society, right? Whether you have a home or you don't have a home, whether you pay too much rent or you pay too little property tax, or you you feel all the inequalities in our system. It's so manifested through homeownership, and which is so cornerstone to supposedly the American dream. And that's why I was really motivated to keep working on this policy. It's something, even with social housing, which I talked about, was one of my platform ideas. Before I even understood the term social housing, it's kind of where I was going towards. But I think we need to have all options on the table. We need to be building a lot of housing. We need to be protecting the people who live in them, and we have to uplift the people who are unhoused now. And polling shows across the state, wherever you are, housing and homelessness, #1 issues that rank up there with, say, COVID and other issues like that. So these are huge pressing issues that we need as many innovative solutions as possible. And I think it's our state responsibility now that it's become a state, if not national issue. We have to step up with as many options as possible.
Yeah, you know, Alex, one of the things that I always think is really interesting, and like just looking at kind of like the political side of like the pro-housing, the pro-housing conversation, right? I think there's often this perception that the voters are anti-housing, right? That they are, you know, the voters tend to be leaning much more NIMBY-ish, right? Like low density. But like time and time again, polling and, like you being elected, right? Assemblymember Wicks being elected, Senator Skinner, Senator Weiner, Assemblymember Chu, like we see that voters very much want to elect people who are, unabashedly very proud pro-housing candidates. And I'm just curious, like, what do you think accounts for kind of this, almost like this misunderstanding between what the voters want and why there is a perception that somehow voters don't necessarily want housing? I'm just kind of curious. Do you have any explanations to where that seems to why that seems to be?
I think this is a very real problem in which people can experience day to day through their property tax, or their rent, or their mortgage, or being unhoused, right? They understand the crisis, and I think that fuels more and more desire to see solutions, right? And I think generally too, there's a squeaky wheel effect, right? I think while there are a few very vocal people who are just absolutely against any sort of growth, in fact, maybe they want the opposite, shrinkage in some communities, I think by and large, most people think there needs to be a balance between more opportunity for people to live here and the kinds of community things we gripe about, right? Because I think there's a misunderstanding sometimes in our housing politics, and I think it's kind of fomented by our opposition, that there's only two types of housing, right? You have your American style single family tract home of some sort, and it's beautiful, or you have this high rise monstrosity, right? But there's so much diversity in between and so many options that, and I think as people get more acquainted with this, understand it better, I think that dichotomy melts away and you soften that kind of opposition too.
I appreciate that. So, Alex, you have definitely been a champion for social housing, right? Since the time you ran, and, and you continue to really champion. And, this is a question that I get fairly frequently, and I am not sure how to answer it. So I want to go to the expert. How do you define what is social housing? How do you define it?
Yeah, social housing, speaking in the American context, social housing is generally housing that's produced for all incomes, either by a public entity, so what we're doing through Assembly Bill 2053, creating the California Housing Authority, or generally through some sort of nonprofits or not for profit entity of some sort that preserves and builds housing. That's kind of the generally consensus of American definition. I lean very heavily, as evidenced by my bill, on the European and Asian examples, which is the public option, the government stepping in and saying we need to also be on the market. We also need to be handling this crisis or handling this municipality. And the key difference I would say is, sometimes I get this question too, is like, what is the difference between say American social housing and American public housing? I think in other countries, the term itself is probably analogous, there's the same, but the difference I think in American context, which is important, is social housing is for all incomes. It's a municipal universal service versus public housing, unfortunately, has become a welfare status, right? If we treated that the same way we do with our roads or schools, we'd say this road is for poor people only because they deserve to ride on these roads, right? But housing, as we know, is a human right. It's universal, right? So why should we not be treating it that way? So we are trying to escape that route, but also learn from those mistakes in American policymaking, which informs us, right, to make better social housing. And there's a lot of great examples out there in the world, even in the United States, of good social housing.
Great, thank you. Right, this is the model that Singapore uses. Right, that they build housing. The Singapore government builds housing for all levels of income, and that is interesting. Okay, great. But just to be clear, though, right, like in your model, you would see nonprofit developers also potentially building social housing in California.
Yeah, in our definition, because I think it does owe to some of the work that a lot of nonprofits are striving to do. That's inclusive in our definition, but the main thrust of our bill is about a public entity developer. And this is something we hope to help the creation of more missing middle housing. And as the market, as our nonprofit partners all go out and build as much as possible, I think we have to also have another option out there to work with the community. Sometimes communities have different tastes and wants as well, right? And build more that's at cost rather than for profit.
Sure. So Alex, so beyond social housing, what are some of your other priorities or other specific pieces of legislation that you are supporting or championing or keeping an eye on?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still working on LSAC reform, which I think is a very reasonable and small guardrail against displacement. Displacement and gentrification are very real issues that I think we must confront in this day and age. I think we have to acknowledge that and this kind of gets mixed up in that fear against housing, right? Is housing is a hot commodity, especially single family home neighborhoods know this, but I think these are hot commodities and there are people out there who want to make money off of it, right? But we have to make sure that we are guarding communities against displacement gentrification. And LSAC reform basically says for the big BlackRock type entities out there, you have to put some, we call some dampeners on evicting people for profit. And that's gonna be something I'm bringing back. And we're gonna be working more on eviction defense and tenant protections too, because I believe in all the approach, right? We got to protect the people who live in the houses, and we got to produce more people who live in homes.
And that's it. How are you feeling like, that the year is the legislative session is shaping up as far as housing legislation?
Yeah, I think definitely housing is always tough in our house. It's not even amongst our own party. We don't have a consensus about exactly what our approach is towards housing. I think there's acknowledgement of the problem. I am optimistic now that we also have a great chair, Assemblymember Buffy Wicks as well, who will lead us in these conversations. I'm optimistic. I think as the real crises grow, every year we delay on action, right? There is real rising rents, real rising costs, and real rising homelessness. We are pressured, for better or for worse, to act more immediately. And I think there's a lot of attention and root interest into it. It's just we need to be working towards the common goals and get things done. Because in the housing world, right, just because we pass the law, it still takes a couple of years to take effect. Unfortunately, it's not like some other policy areas where we change something and, in a year or two, you'll see difference. But for construction, there's time that's involved. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah, and Alex, in previous years, or for the last couple of years, we definitely have seen some housing packages come out of the Senate. Are you expecting, do you have hope that perhaps, I know there's been a little bit more focus specifically on housing in the Assembly. Do you think we may cross our fingers, see some type of housing package perhaps come out of the Assembly this year?
I hope so. I'm not sure if we will have a housing package as it's labeled in the Senate, but I think we will see a good plethora of housing bills. Okay.
All right, sounds good. And then Alex, as if you were, right, we have a whole bunch of advocates on this call or, on this webinar. So what, as a legislator, what do you think are the best way advocates can be helpful for legislators like yourself who are so clearly pro-housing, and we obviously want to be supportive of you and your policy priorities. Like, if you're wave your magic wand, here are the things I would love advocates to be doing.
Yeah. Well, I first have to thank, there's a lot more people on the phone now, certainly. I think there are probably a lot of names on here who are recognized who have helped us with our bill. But I think the top two things I think would be helpful from advocates is, give us your real policy feedback or lived experience feedback. That's so helpful. I cannot tell you how many very great people have emailed our staff or emailed the state and say, have you looked at this part of the bill, or have you even thought about doing this part? And some of those things that sometimes we don't catch these things or don't know at this point. But I really love that constructive feedback, is because even the bill we have today is the result of so much collaboration from so many advocates. It's not just, the produced from some high power think tank or something. It's like a true community foundationally built. There are so many activists across California who helped us do that. So your feedback is really helpful. The second thing is, and I cannot tell you how effective it is like advocating for our bill or this effort, like 2050, that's why 2053, to your local legislator, especially if they're not me. So you should definitely vouch to your legislator. This is cool. I have had literally other legislators from Los Angeles tell me that someone saw them at a restaurant, they went up to them and they said they hope they'll support the social housing bill. I did not, ask people to do that, but that is helpful. It sticks in people's mind. And especially if you have folks in outside the Bay Area, which I think we're very good on housing generally, especially outside, is very, very helpful, because this is a new concept, right? I think in many ways, social housing is a new concept and requires some different frame of focus thinking, but having that real grassroots support, I think, means a lot. So definitely, advocate to your legislators. And then if you have really great feedback or can help us bring more groups to the table, that would always be really helpful.
Cool, that sounds good. Alex, I'm just going to take a quick second that we noticed that there's a couple of electeds in the audience that we just want to welcome. So our good friend, and I'm glad that he joins us very frequently, Hawaii State Senator Stanley Chang is in the audience. Welcome, Stanley. Always good to have you. And City of Gilroy Council Member Zach Hilton is also here. So we just want to welcome that. Hey, Alex, I'm wondering if we could, dive into a little bit of, so the 3 Ps. Now I want to be clear, right? We are an unabashedly a production focused, a 3P organization, but really production focused. And I'm just, so what I'm wondering is that, obviously your social housing bill would be a significant piece of production legislation. Well, how do you feel the odds are for getting some really good production pieces of legislation through the legislature and onto the governor's desk this year?
I feel really good about it. I think the administration has a strong focus, and as they're, with their housing accountability unit and HCD right now, doing a lot of great work at making sure we produce enough housing to meet the great need. I do think, though, as we're all in housing advocate world, and why the 3P is important is we do need to have a balance to it, because we don't want to continue to give the ammo to those folks who don't want to see change, right? Oh, my lights are off. Don't want to see change, right? Like we did come very close to having a very terrible ballot initiative, right? That would go on the ballot and just strip government agency from having any real meaningful direction in housing. So I think it's, well, the lights just turned off for me, but I think it's really important that we have that balance to it, right? We have to, why the 3Ps is important is, no single P itself, in my belief, will solve the housing crisis. If we build a lot of homes and no one can afford to live them, or they all get evicted in couple of years, would have failed, right? But if we also do just preservation or just protection alone, it'll also leave out so many families and their opportunities, right? So it needs to be that balance. And that's what I'm hoping to strike, is that Californian voters and Californians in general need to know that there's new opportunities out there for them to have a home, but also make sure that they're not afraid of losing their home at the moment too, right? So we have to have that balance. And I think that's a tricky part about it. And in many ways, housing is still a new frontier at the state level. I remember, talking to folks that housing at the state level used to be seen as just a San Francisco problem at the state, and no one really took it, never did a lot in housing. And now you have people all over the state, Orange County, Central Valley, and all talking about housing crisis. And I think we need to latch onto a comprehensive set of, hopefully a package one day, but comprehensive set of principles and policy ideas to, yes, build a lot more housing at all income levels for sure, but also make sure people aren't losing their homes or becoming homeless, because that's the great tragedy, right? We don't want, while there's a lot of homes being built, a lot of people to fall onto the streets too. That'd be awful.
Yeah, and how do you think that the balance has been struck pretty well so far?
No.
Okay.
Unfortunately not. It took a lot of effort for us to just pass SB 9, SB 10. There's a lot of also great bills that did not get the spotlight in that sense, but a lot of great, I think, production focused bills and help like that. But we haven't been able to do things like the Ellis Act, right? So we need to have these big, on all 3 Ps, we have to have big efforts and serious efforts on all 3, lest we peril into the opponents' arguments that all we think about is a certain interest group, right?
Sure. So Alex, I got notified from my staff and a couple of other electeds, and so I want to make sure that we welcome them all. City of Campbell, Councilmember Liz Gibbons, Mayor of Sunnyvale, Larry Klein, Cupertino City Council members, Councilmember Rod Sinks, and Cupertino City Council Member Hung Wei is here also. So I just wanted to welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Alex, how do you feel? So what I can tell you is that from the advocacy world's point of view, that often a lot of really good housing legislation, and specifically, I want to be clear, I'm more talking about the production side of things, often really struggle with your colleagues from Los Angeles. And I'm just wondering, do you see opportunity for that dynamic to change? And I mean, in some ways, I feel like it's starting to, but I'm just curious, what do you think? And again, from the advocates, for what can we as advocates do to help bring that change about, maybe even faster?
Yeah, Los Angeles is always a place with many unique characteristics, right? But I do think that's changing. Even on the social housing bill, our joint author is Carrillo from Los Angeles, and I don't think she would ever describe her community as affluent by any sense, but I think it's important that we do bring in more folks from across the state in different areas into this coalition, into housing making policy. And I think the impacts of the housing crisis are being felt just as severely in Los Angeles as it is in the Bay Area. So I do see a lot of hope in that. And I think with advocates, we definitely need a lot of work on our Southern California members, but I think it's helpful. And I think actually sometimes what Senator Chang, who's on here, talks about a lot of time is it's helpful for people, especially in the housing world, to see and touch and feel almost that the thing that we're proposing is not scary, right? I mean, just think about all the conversations we had about SB 9, which by all accounts is good, but modest reform. It's not going to be end of the world like the people are pitching. But I think that dichotomy between you've only got the single family home or the skyscraper is very prevalent amongst a lot of policymakers, unfortunately. And it's important that people are shown the options and examples out there. And it's not just this good versus evil fight about housing that's always out there,
Yeah, I think you hit on something that we think a lot about, and we talk about it, right? Like the fear of change, that fear it's real. And I think too often as advocates, when we interact with someone who is expressing fear, we hit them with facts and data and things like that, as opposed to just simply saying like, listen, we understand like change can be really, really hard, right? And I think that often it's incumbent upon the advocates to sometimes do a better job of meeting people where they are from a fear. Because I think that once they experience the change and they're like, oh, it isn't so scary, right? Then they're much more open to it. But like I think that for us to deny that the fear is like a real tangible thing for the person experiencing it, I think that we often miss out on the opportunity to eventually, convert someone who's like, hey, I hear you, this is where it is. One of the things that Mayor Breed often talked about, and I'm curious if this is something that you've experienced also, she said that when she was running for mayor, and she would run into people, on the west side of San Francisco who were perhaps uncomfortable with the idea of more housing, she would just ask the simple question of like, well, would you like your children to live in this neighborhood? Or would you like your grandchildren to live in this neighborhood? And she would say that would often just kind of soften, right, the reaction. And so I'm just kind of wondering if you, like, I assume you run into this type of stuff, on a fairly regular basis, but is there any particular ways that you find that engaging people who may present as skeptical upfront that's worked well for you?
No, that approach works so universally well, and especially in my district and in my experience, when I'm knocking on their door, they think about their child or grandchild that looks like me, that's my age, and I talk about how we need to have our communities together, right? And that's the real struggle that I hear all the time, and I think that really does motivate people to accept change. Maybe not the full throttle change that sometimes I think we need to meet the moment, but we definitely some of the change. I think that really helps to humanize it. And I think it also helps to know, and I think very much even suburbanites understand this, I hear so frequently from people, they say, if I were to do what I did in 1960, 1980 now, never would be able to do it, right? They understand that disparity and that gulf of opportunity. And I think definitely bring up what do you want the future to be is really important. Also really important, I point out, is even though my Silicon Valley suburban district is what it is today, it used to be all just like farm fields. The reason we got to where we are today and enjoy the things we like is because we subdivide all the farms, we turn them into single family homes, and we did all these things. So change can bring about great things if we reflect on how far we've gone too.
That's great. We are just about at the end of time. I feel like I could, blabber on about housing with you for a long time. Any final thoughts that you wanted to share with the group before we hand it off to the next panel?
Yeah, I mean, last thing is just, if you want to get involved or learn more, go to californiasocialhousing.org. So californiasocialhousing.org. Really great website set up by some of our advocates actually, and really want to have your help in ushering in a new age of housing production. I think social housing is going to give us a huge new tool in the tool belt, and really change the face of housing. And really cannot thank you all enough for all you do. And especially some people on this call, you keep my sanity when I deal with housing politics. So thank you so much for all the great work you do.
And, Alex, you're a friend and, a real champion of housing. We really appreciate everything you do at the Housing Action Coalition. If there's ever anything that we can be helpful with, please be in touch. And I'm sure we will be talking to you soon.
Thank you all.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce Regina Celestin Williams to the stage. Regina, can you join us? I am going to just tell everyone a little bit about Regina. So Regina is the new executive director of Silicon Valley at Home, a longtime friend and partner of the Housing Action Coalitions. We're looking forward to continuing our close collaboration with her and the Silicon Valley at Home team. Regina spent her entire career working towards housing and economic justice through affordable housing and community development. Prior to joining Silicon Valley at Home, she served as Director of Housing Development at First Community Housing, a leading San Jose-based affordable housing developer. We're delighted and grateful that Regina is taking time out of her busy schedule to moderate today's panel conversation. And so while we're waiting for Regina to join us is our Councilmember Lopez, Vice Mayor Cisneros, and Mayor Ramirez. Are you here to join us? Hey guys, and Regina, I think you are here now also. Is that correct?
Hello, everyone.
So nice for you. Nice to see you, and thank you all so much for joining us. Regina, I know this is going to be in great hands. I'm going to turn this over to you for now. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you. I am so thrilled to be moderating this panel of elected leaders representing Sunnyvale, Mountain View, and Campbell today. So I just want to say I really appreciate Housing Action Coalition and our co-hosts, the Greenbelt Alliance, California YIMBY Action, all of you for putting this excellent discussion together. As many people in the audience know, SV at Home is the voice for affordable housing in Silicon Valley. We're an affordable housing advocacy organization that works all across Santa Clara County to produce more affordable homes, preserve existing affordable housing, and protect vulnerable residents from displacement. And I am the new executive director of SV at Home. I've been here 3 months, and I'm just so grateful to be able to be a part of this conversation today. So our elected officials, 3 of whom we have with us today, they're key partners with us in both setting the affordable housing policy agendas in their cities and actually taking the decisions needed to pass policies, approve developments, and meet their city's goals. So I want to thank them for their long history of collaboration with us and their championing of affordable housing in their communities. I personally am looking forward to growing this relationship with you all and supporting you all through our work together. So, the 3 of you all have been true champions. You've campaigned on affordable housing as a priority. So let's jump in to the discussion and hearing a little bit more about your work. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Councilmember Lopez. Actually, I'm going to have you go ahead and do your own introduction. Why don't you tell me, Councilmember Lopez, a little bit about your housing story and also about you.
Great. Thanks so much. So glad to be with you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to Housing Action Coalition and all the incredible groups putting on this event, and to all our audience members. Really excited for this discussion. I'm Sergio Lopez, council member here in Campbell. Housing is really central to my story and really to how I first got involved in politics. I was born and raised here in Campbell. I'm the son of two immigrants who my mom and dad who came here from Mexico and settled down. And I never really expected to be in this position, let alone sitting here today talking about these issues. When I was growing up, it was really just focus on your education and make sure you get a good job. And I was going to be the first, as a first generation immigrant, to be the first in my extended family to graduate from college. So that was my parents' dream. And as part of that dream, we opened up a small business, a restaurant that we had going to be able to chip away for a college fund. So I'd go in and help run it in the summers after school. And by the time that I was in middle school, along with saving up and then with hard work, we actually had owned our own home for a few years, my family. Unfortunately, we experienced something that a lot of people went through during the Great Recession, really hitting some economic headwinds. My dad lost his job, side job, the job that he's working on the side for the health benefits. We ended up losing the restaurant, and our home went into foreclosure. And I still remember at the age of 12 having the experience of sitting in my dining room and unannounced having these strangers walk through our door, because to them our house was a commodity. It was in the market. It was being traded, I'm sure, between some hedge funds across the country. To us, it was it was my childhood home and our home. And so that experience really stayed with me. And after a couple of years of really struggling with that and what to do, fell into working in politics through some great mentors, and realizing that not only could I have a voice, but that actually my voice was needed as someone who had lived firsthand through these issues. So I got my start over a decade ago and haven't looked back since, with deep experience, particularly at the regional level, but I worked at the state and national level as well. I was able to get a full scholarship to go on to Yale University, knowing that I just wanted to learn everything I could to come back immediately to my own community and be able to share my story and help shape my community for the better. I ran for an open seat in 2020 in a very competitive election as a proudly pro-housing candidate. And actually launched back in the middle of 2019, which I can tell you is earlier than anybody here had ever run for council, because I wanted to build up the infrastructure and have the chance to tell my story. And when COVID hit, people were talking about the exact same things. How are we going to support our businesses that are struggling? And how are we going to make sure to address the housing insecurity and the housing crisis that our community is dealing with? So I know we're going to get much more into some of the specifics of our communities, but that's my story and part of why I'm so excited to be with you today.
Thank you, council member. I appreciate the authenticity with which you're sharing with us today. Okay, so Mayor Ramirez, if you don't mind, tell us about yourself and your housing story.
Sure, happy to. First, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Very good, thank you. So my name is Lucas. I serve as mayor of the city of Mountain View, and I am distinguished in being the least credentialed and least interesting member of this panel. I'm here to listen to and learn from my smart and noble colleagues more than I am to contribute, but to the extent I have anything insightful or interesting to offer, I will do my best. I ran for city council in 2016 after a great number of renters had organized in the summer and fall of 2015 to share their housing stories to the Mountain View City Council. And they were heartbreaking. We had heard from, I think, literally hundreds of predominantly Spanish-speaking, predominantly but not exclusively Latinx, Latino members of our community who were deeply impacted by evictions without cause or tremendous rent increases, $1,000, over a month and that kind of thing from what they had been paying. And it was very difficult to listen to. It was important for the council and the public to hear those stories, but it was, I think, unanticipated. And the council struggled at that time. They held a study session in October 2015, heard from both sides, from the renters who had organized and their advocates, and also from rental property owners who gave their own perspective, and ultimately decided to take action that was deemed insufficient by the members of the community who had organized at that time. The council directed staff to return with essentially a right to lease ordinance requiring rental property owners to offer a 1-year or 6-month lease to renters. And what the residents did then was collect signatures and place a charter amendment on the ballot in 2016, which became Measure V, a rent control measure, the first that Mountain View has seen, I think, since the late 70s or early 80s. And at a time, incidentally, when a couple of other communities were seeing similar rent control measures. And I decided to jump into the council race at that time. Like Councilmember Lopez, it was very competitive. I was one, so I think there were 9 candidates. I was one of 2 who supported Measure V, and I lost, but Measure V won. And I think it sent some mixed signals to the council and to the city about what it was precisely that our community wanted. I think if I could have picked the outcome, that would have been the one I wanted. I'm glad Measure V passed, and it didn't really matter to me all that much that I lost. But I had an opportunity to run again in the next cycle after a member of the council declined to seek re-election. And I ran on a similar platform, supportive of rent control, but my primary focus was housing production. And this time I had the good fortune to win. So that's sort of a truncated history of how I got here. And I'm looking forward also to responding to the other questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're so appreciative of, your boldness and in your work and running for council and then for mayor. So Vice Mayor Cisneros.
Can you hear me now?
Absolutely.
Like the old commercial. I'm old enough to remember that. Okay. So now we're good. Switch to another device, such as the world we live in. But I suppose I'll introduce myself and tell my housing story, why housing is important to me and what I do in the community. So my name is Alysa Cisneros. I'm the Vice Mayor of Sunnyvale. I was elected to City Council to represent District 2, the downtown area of Sunnyvale, in 2020. So I'm relatively new. And my housing story started as soon as I was born, because I was born here in the Silicon Valley, where I lived with my parents and my 2 siblings in Sunnyvale primarily, but my parents split up, and so they lived in different cities as well. And through that experience, when I was born, my dad was a janitor and my mom was a medical assistant. And so we didn't have a whole lot of money. My dad started going to college so that he could progress through the company he was a janitor at, which was Hewlett-Packard. And through that process of him going to school, working full-time, my mom was working full-time, we were just kind of making ends meet. And there were a lot of months where we were not sure how rent was going to get paid. And they shielded us from as much of that as possible, but there was definitely a big pinch in our family, especially with these divided, everyone was busy and just trying to get by. My dad eventually did progress through his education, and now he's a global product manager at Hewlett-Packard through his education. And so that experience of struggling with housing while also reaching for higher goals and trying to do what's best for your family at the same time really shaped the way I was looking at this, what it was like to live in the Silicon Valley. And so fast forward, I had my daughter when I was 19 years old, not a lot of money to my name, and I was a single mom. And I really struggled to find any housing that I could afford at all, and was really at the mercy of, helpful family members, friends, and just working multiple jobs and trying to get that rent together. So that was just the ongoing struggle through it. And eventually I got my master's degree, had this more steady income, but I had always thought in the back of my head, like, how do we make this better and more livable for more people? Because I was thinking more to the people that I was meeting in line to apply for food stamps when I was thinking about policy and studying policy and getting a master's degree. And how do we go ahead and uplift those people and make sure that there is a space for every single person in our community, from the people who do janitorial work, wash our dishes, all the way to the tech workers who go ahead and are an important part of this economy too, and there's space for everyone. And just having that ethos going through as I began my work in politics and in public policy. So that's really where housing is just drilled down into who I am and these fundamental principles. And so then of course you learn, well, how is that an actionable policy item? And so what I came to is that it's that place for everyone. It's creating more housing, diverse kinds of housing. Some people need to live in condos. Some people need to live in apartments. There needs to be a place for every area of affordability, and recognizing that market rate plays a really big part in making sure that we have affordability and avoid gentrification in a lot of instances. And so I was working on the policy end primarily in education policy, but transitioned over and ran for council, where I really started to dig deep into the housing policy piece. And so far, I've been really excited to be part of finishing our downtown area. And there's a little bit of noise going on in the background. I think my dog turned on the TV. Actually, she appears to be watching Survivor. So forgive that. And so we're finishing our downtown area. We're building over 400 units of housing, finishing off the downtown specific plan, where we have greatly increased the density that we will have in the downtown area, but that needs to be all throughout Sunnyvale. So we have 4 specific plans going on at the same time, where we're looking at major housing projects and development, and mixing that with and supporting it with retail as well, and office. So striking that correct balance, or what feels correct for that area, and being really nuanced in our approach to finding out different blends work for different parts of the city. But if we're able to go ahead and accomplish that, and then expand our reach through this housing element process, which is what I'm really excited to dig into, then we can figure out how to incorporate all corners in and make sure that we desegregate and integrate our entire Sunnyvale community to support having a place for everyone. So that would be my answer to that question. I really look forward to talking with my colleagues here on the panel today, and to continue to work with all of you today.
That was wonderful. Vice Mayor Cisneros, you really started off our conversation. My first question is, what are the housing priorities for your cities, and sort of what is the framework that you're using to sort of support more housing and affordable housing in your communities? And I think you did an excellent job of setting the table, talking a little bit about Sunnyvale. So how about we go to Mayor Ramirez next?
I am struggling to know where to begin. So personally, I agree with Vice Mayor Cisneros. I think the housing element is the most important work that we will be doing as a council in Mountain View for the next year. And I'd like to be interactive. I don't know if this will actually work, but I'm going to put in the chat the draft site inventory that our city staff are bringing to the council on Tuesday. I have some concerns about it. If those of you who have access to the chat or are able to view it, you'll see that the housing is concentrated in 3 areas: the El Camino corridor, North Bayshore, and East Wisman. And if you know very much about Mountain View, I think you'll realize that it's very difficult to claim that this site inventory affirmatively furthers fair housing. It concentrates a lot of housing in East Wisman and North Bayshore, where there are few or no amenities, no schools, for instance, in those areas. Along El Camino, we have a lot of affordable housing going up, which is great, but saying we're going to further concentrate our affordable housing on El Camino suggests pretty strongly that we're not doing, I think, the best job we could in I'm going to use the words that you use, Vice Mayor Cisneros, because I think they're exactly spot on in desegregating and reintegrating our communities, right? We're talking about 11,135 net new housing units over the next 8 years, which is ambitious. Good more than half of that is affordable, which is great. And concentrating it in areas where it's politically easy to build housing and not in areas where it might be a little bit more challenging, but we're actually achieving those affirmatively furthering fair housing goals. I feel like we're not off to a great start personally. So this is what my colleagues can expect to hear on Tuesday. Very briefly, a couple of other important items that we will not be completing this year, but the council will be working on over the next couple of years. We've had a tremendous challenge with displacement resulting from the demolition of existing naturally affordable, generally rent-controlled housing. And historically, SB 330 changes the calculus a little bit, but historically, the challenge has been the projects that were going before the council were code compliant. They adhered to our zoning and development standards and were, exactly what our code was telling developers to do. The problem was it often resulted in fewer units and it demolished more affordable housing, rent-controlled housing, replaced it with extremely expensive row houses and townhouses. It really isn't, it's not the type of redevelopment that achieves the goals that we're discussing here. And so the council prioritized an update to our conventional multifamily zoning district, R3. That was done in June 2019. We have not made very much progress on it, but we anticipate beginning work on that again following our housing element work. Coupled with that is an anti-displacement, or what staff has called the displacement response strategy, which is an integral component. Housing production is great, but if it's occurring in areas where existing housing already is serving people, it creates a different set of challenges. So those are the three primary big picture housing oriented objectives that the Mountain View Council will be taking on over the next few years.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I recognize, I identify greatly with the challenges around affirmatively furthering fair housing, especially in Silicon Valley and in the peninsula. And I recognize that all of your communities are different and have diverse populations that differ from each other. But I am curious to shift to something a little bit more on the hopeful side of things. And so I'm going to go to Councilmember Lopez and ask you, I know that there are challenges that you'd like to share, but I'm going to ask you to sort of start with what you're hopeful about and the opportunities that you see around housing in your community.
Sure. I can just tell you, I'm thrilled to come on to council at a time where we were in my past year where we're getting started on our housing element process, and to really help shape that, be a part of that. So I've just been having a blast my first year working on these issues. I really think that for those of you who maybe haven't been paying as close attention, to really look at Campbell as a model for what we can do when staff is empowered and has the support to really think big on housing issues. We're a smaller community in some ways, but I think really everything that we kind of talk about, especially on housing Twitter, as what cities should be doing, I see us as implementing that. So for example, we got a shout out in the San Francisco Chronicle after a long range of, maybe bad actors on some of these issues, getting lauded for what I think they kind of looked at as a model SB9 urgency ordinance last year, to really help our residents who are interested and we were having questions about that, get that implemented. During the housing element process, not only do I think we've had a very good high quality process, where staff built out a whole matrix looking at affirmatively furthering fair housing issues and prioritizing sites based on that. We actually have an incredible, I've never seen to this extent, an outreach process where staff went down to large employers, property owners, and sought out, who is actually interested in building housing, so that we can ensure that the sites that we have on our draft inventory list are actually places where people are actively looking to build housing. So I think we have a very high quality inventory list. We've been timely, one of the first, if not the first cities in Santa Clara County to get ahead on this process, particularly for the smaller cities. And in January 25th, we had the final meeting on kind of the initial phase of the process, looking at the inventory. And during coming out of that meeting and going into the EIR process, which again, we started back at the end of January, we're nearly doubling our RENA target where we are now in terms of the sites and inventory that we're looking at. So I'm really excited in terms of what we're doing. Of course, that number is going to shift a little and change as we come out of the EIR process, but I think a really high quality process, and I've continually lauded staff for that. I'll also just share in terms of apart from just being very supportive and helping back up staff throughout that process. I'm currently at Duke Divinity School, actually in a remote program for my master's. And as part of that, I've conducted research and published research on what churches can do to address the housing crisis, particularly with affordable housing. And in other areas in Southern California, particularly here in California, there's much more of a history of that. But what I found is that much less on the Bay Area and Santa Clara County. And so I've had many meetings with faith leaders and churches to pursue, discuss affordable housing. And I'm very proud that as part of our initial draft inventory, we do have 2 churches looking at significant projects for affordable housing, which is just something that they never would have, I think, considered prior to some of these conversations. And I've continued publishing that work in national outlets and presented research on it at academic conferences, and have had a lot of people reach out to me and indicate interest. So I'm really excited that, along with work at the state level by Buffy Wicks and Scott Wiener, that the Yes in God's Backyard movement is growing here as well. And I'm looking forward to supporting that here in the South Bay. So that's just a taste, but as you can tell, I'm pretty pumped up and excited about what we've got going on.
That's wonderful. And I have to tell you, I'm very excited about all of your efforts towards developing on faith-based owned land. I did some of that work on the East Coast and also here in the San Jose area. And absolutely, that's a underutilized resource, and it really is a win-win situation for the community with more housing, and for the faith-based institutions with a newly identified revenue stream. So that's wonderful. Vice Mayor, I want to circle back to you, give you an opportunity to talk about your priorities and any opportunities. What are you hopeful about? And just tell us a little bit about what you've got going on there.
Yeah, I will reference 2 major specific plan areas in the city of Sunnyvale, where I think that we have some of the highest potential for new housing, and also as part of that, creating vibrant communities. Because when you build housing, you want the people who live there and the people around to have a really vibrant and complete experience just right around them. That's important for addressing climate change. It's important for building a people-centric city, and it's important to supporting that housing as well through in the city through additional retail. And so I will talk about Moffett Park. So we have our Moffett Park area, which is, it's been compared in some ways to the Wisman or the Bayshore project over in Mountain View in some ways, but we have a lot of office space, and they're looking to develop an eco-innovation district. So really integrating office and housing and retail and restaurants and outdoor activities that are ecologically sustainable with lots of open space. All there. So it's a huge area over in North Sunnyvale, right up against the bay. And so we have an EIR that went out this year that we approved to study 20,000 units of housing there. So we're waiting to get the results of that back, but we'll continue to have a conversation of how to build that sustainable community in a way that respects the environment and also takes full advantage of the amount of Sunnyvale we have there to create that vibrant community and build those different kinds of housing up there. It's exciting because we don't have an unlimited amount of Sunnyvale. We have a limited amount of Sunnyvale. We only have so much. And so when you look at Moffett Park, you see this as a huge just footprint area where you can really bring a lot of vitality there, especially as North Sunnyvale. You can kind of think of Sunnyvale as divided by train tracks in terms of just how much, how residents feel and the community feels attention is given. So a lot is given to south of the tracks and not as much to the north. That's the general feeling. And so by bringing more vitality and resources and opportunity up into North Sunnyvale through an eco-innovation district, it's really exciting. So being part of that project over the period of time, just getting on council as we're digging into the EIR portion, that's a key priority. And it's going to be big if we're able to incorporate it into our housing element with our arena numbers this year as well. And then we have the El Camino Real specific plan. We're looking at what we're going to do along the El Camino Real corridor. And that's a little trickier because the retail along El Camino is a really important part of our tax base in Sunnyvale. So while we want to build the maximum amount of housing as we could sustain there, we want to also make sure that we're supporting the businesses that it currently exist along there and also encourage continued retail. So we have developers that are looking to build all along that site as we continue to move through that plan. We're getting through to the last stages and working it out. Making sure that everything is SB 9 compliant, and as the new housing bills from the state come down, like SB 330, and figuring out how we're going to go ahead and make sure we're in compliance there, and also support that, like I was speaking about before, it's all about the balance and striking the balance. And that corridor is great for transit. And so when we're thinking about how to build homes around transit and reduce emissions, that's a great way to do it along El Camino. And so those are the two main areas of the city that, in my mind, I look at, and I think that's where I want to really think about how we can think differently about how we organize that in the way that's going to most support that, because we kind of have like this one shot, right? We want to build for the next 30 years. We have to think 30 years out, and we have to think about how these regions like in North Sunnyvale connect to South Sunnyvale, and how does this El Camino corridor connect to Mountain View, our neighbor, or going down to Santa Clara and San Jose. How does it all work together into a whole picture regionally? And I know we're going to talk about that a little later too. So I'm excited to dig into the regional aspects about what we're doing, but here in Sunnyvale, those are the key priority areas for us. And then I would be remiss to say that we're also thinking about how to incorporate housing for very low income people too, and touching on homeless housing and figuring out what sites might be available for those opportunities as well.
Well, I just have to tell you all that being a part of this conversation, hearing you all talk, is what makes me hopeful. It's absolutely exciting to see this sort of leadership, bold, fearless leadership when it comes to looking at the future of our valley. And so I want to talk a little bit about civic engagement. I want to talk about the fact that I can tell you myself personally, the more as I come into this role at SB at Home, the more I learn about the moment that we're in and how decisions that are made locally are going to drive, the experience, the quality of life for us, for our neighbors, for years to come. And so it's so critical to engage folks in this conversation and make sure that folks understand the level of a housing crisis that we're in. Make sure that they understand the sort of opportunities that exist for us to really build enough housing for all of us so that we can all thrive. So I'm curious, what kinds of approaches you all are taking to better engage people, folks who haven't traditionally had a seat at the table, who haven't been engaged in this conversation. How are you making sure that their voices are heard? And I'm especially cognizant of those of you who have lived experience with housing vulnerability. How are we reaching those folks most impacted by the housing crisis and making sure they're engaged in this process? So let's see, I'll start with Councilmember Lopez.
Sure. I'll say by just touching briefly on the fact that when I was running, it was very important to me to just reach out to all groups and to be fearless and honest about where I was on housing issues. I actually, when this was being debated, went out and wrote a local op-ed in support of SB 50, and to not apologize and house away. And even when folks disagree on the policy, to realize that they feel that their views are respected and heard, and that they can be part of the process. Was very proud of being clear about where I stood on those issues. It's certainly been an important focus on during the housing element process, just to use that example. And staff, like I said, has done a great job of reaching out, particularly to property owners and business owners. What's always more difficult and challenging is reaching many more transient communities, other types of communities where it's much more challenging to reach out, and traditional methods might not be as helpful. So thankfully, especially when I was running, that was a particular focus of me, to make sure I was reaching those communities. And I'm always trying to bring, into the room where decisions are being made, who's not at the table, who's missing from the decision-making process. And just because, a particular, a group may be particularly organized, who else can we bring into the process and make sure that the loudest voices don't automatically equate, when you're hearing them, to a majority, which might not be the case, and just make sure that we're being inclusive. So it's always a continual process, but I definitely just try to meet with as many folks as possible personally, and reach out and say, here's how you get involved. Whether or not my views, personally personally agree with them, I think that's immaterial to knowing how to get engaged and be part of the process. So that's always something that I'm working on, and at the same time that I think we as a community can always improve.
Great, thank you. Mayor Ramirez, do you have thoughts on that question?
I'm a politician. I have thoughts on everything. I feel like, and I'm a little disorganized in my thoughts on this, because there are many concrete examples I could point to that are sort of divergent in where they might lead. So the first thing that comes to mind, though, is that we ignore our constituents at our peril. And I think the story I shared at the beginning about our renter community organizing in 2015 and 2016 to ask the council first, do something, we're suffering, please fix it, only to have the council return with a solution that didn't quite meet the needs of the community. The community decided to act on its own accord and placed a very strong rent control measure on the ballot that ultimately was approved as a charter amendment. So now we have a rent control law hard coded into our charter, which means it's difficult to change. And the council could have adopted an ordinance that was easier to modify, perhaps a little bit more moderate in its implementation. You know, and I say this as a supporter of Measure D, right? The council elected not to do that, and that's how we ended up with an outcome that was a little bit more challenging for the council to accept. So we ignore our constituents at our peril. At the same time, I'm reminded of a conversation I had over the weekend. Mountain View YIMBY, which is an extraordinary group of advocates and watchdogs that I have the pleasure of working with regularly, organized a walking tour of our site inventory that I had shared in the chat. So we walked around dominantly El Camino and Latham and spoke about a number of the proposed sites for inclusion. And at the end of it, I spoke with a member of the organizing team who shared, you know, Lucas, I spend a lot of time encouraging people to come to public meetings. And I fire people up, right? If you want to make a difference in your community, you have to go to the planning commission meetings. You have to go to the council meetings. You have to talk to your council members, send emails. And routinely, I'm disappointed by the city's inaction or non-response or insufficient response. And there's only so much goodwill out there. I can't keep turning people out if the city keeps ignoring us. And it was a hard criticism to hear. And I don't think it's necessarily wrong. We've had a lot of very strongly pro-housing input in a variety of contexts. And not to disparage my city too much, but it often feels like we take action that is not as robust as it needs to be to address what I think is a crisis. And that's how we end up with a draft site inventory that looks like this, you know, despite a substantial amount of public input that suggests we could be a lot more ambitious in our approach. So we'll see. If the, you know, I think public engagement is crucial. I don't know if we've done an effective job, at least in my community, in reaching out to the people who are interested in helping, right? Renters, low-income people, housing vulnerable people. I don't know if our policies necessarily reflect input from those communities. And maybe things will change. We still have a lot of work to do. But I do hope that, I wish I could be more of an optimist in this panel. I'm clearly not. But I feel like that doesn't mean that we should cease engaging those communities and that we should stop mobilizing people, because it's essential that they continue to participate.
Yeah, and I think what I would offer, you know, is that we, the greater we, right? The folks here, SBA at Home, Housing Action Coalition, all of us pro-housers, you know, we're here in South Silicon Valley to support those residents in your community. And it's all of our jobs, all of our responsibilities to bring their voices to the table. If as much as we have space in the room, they should have space in the room. As much as we have seats at the table, they should. And certainly at SB at Home, we're committed to amplifying those voices that are missing. So, you know, I appreciate your honesty, because that means we all have more work to do, right? Vice Mayor Cisneros, where do you stand on, you know, efforts to engage the community, and especially those who are most impacted?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I really just want to give a shout out to our city staff for being really flexible and innovative with how we reach out to people, especially because of the pandemic. That just rose a whole bunch of new challenges, and how do we get a hold of people and get them engaged effectively? And I think it's a double-edged sword. We've really had to go ahead and invent things as we go. But also because we're doing things remotely, it's easier to get people to come to public meetings and different listening sessions that the city sets up around different issues, around different things that we're doing, especially around housing. So reaching them through social media, through bill inserts, making sure that we get the word on next door, like getting the word out as far as possible, and then seeing who shows up. I think that we need to have a little bit more intentionality, especially around those communities of concern or people or the most impacted, as you say. That's always going to be something that we need to be really thoughtful about. We went through a redistricting process recently. And while that's not directly housing related, the amount of engagement that we were able to generate through various listening sessions and forums was actually really quite remarkable when staff showed us the numbers of how many people they were able to get show up. But then you look at kind of the demographics of the people who showed up. They were predominantly people who are, more affluent and familiar with engaging with public processes, perhaps, or more formal processes. So there's room to grow, but we're working on it in those ways. And, I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said, SB at home is here, HAC is there, these advocacy groups are there. And I absolutely rely on that in a group like Livable Sunnyvale, who focus a lot on housing, to do that community outreach and bring those perspectives and voices to council through emails and letters and public testimony. It's been really powerful to see. And it's been really great whenever I've been able to engage with you. And that's why it's so nice to be on a panel like this today. It's just building those relationships further. But I want to emphasize the importance of continuing the remote option in our public meetings and in our public outreach. It just makes it a lot easier. As a single mom, I was not able to go to a lot of public meetings in my own city, actually, because I was working, getting dinner on the table. I was going to public meetings for my job for another city. And so it was like, how do I go ahead and balance that out? As soon as everything went, you had the remote option, you can keep up with these things. You have that option. And as long as you have that kind of outreach, you can get the more diverse group of people. So as a city, I think in order to continue with the process of engaging folks who otherwise might not be able to go to an in-person meeting because they have family responsibilities or work on off hours, they're not a 9-to-5 worker, it's going to be really important to continue with that. And we are doing things in different languages and trying out different forums and ways to outreach to specific communities using, different cultural resources and talking to people who are trusted in the community, who are community leaders for those underrepresented groups. We've had some success with that. So it's a multi-pronged approach, and you have to do it. There's no one thing that's going to bring those people to the table. It's doing a lot of things at one time and making sure that it's constantly top of mind when you're thinking about who's going to get in the room. And I also want to speak to having a robust business community relationship. So like we have both a Chamber of Commerce and a Downtown Business Association. So there are multiple avenues for business and retailers to come and have their be heard as well. And they're not exactly in that, when you think about the most impacted groups, but they are oftentimes when we're redeveloping our communities. So we want to make sure that they're always in touch too. It's getting the full perspective to the greatest extent that we can.
That's great. And I'm so glad that we all had the chance to sort of talk about civic engagement. I appreciate you all really highlighting the work that we're doing now around the housing element. But I do want to acknowledge that we have about 13 minutes left. And so the question that you've been waiting for, Vice Mayor Cisneros, I'm going to ask to you alone, which is, we know our housing crisis is a regional crisis. So that means we need regional solutions. What's your approach to working in coordination with surrounding cities? And then we'll try to take some Q&A from the audience. So if you don't mind answering that question.
Sure. There are two big important parts to that question, I think. And number one is building those relationships with other elected leaders and other people who are civically engaged in organizations in other cities learn about what they're doing that's working well, or challenges that they're facing. Like, if I hadn't been listening to Sergio here right now, I would know, like, wow, maybe the faith-based community, that's an awesome avenue and opportunity, especially when we're talking about that very low income housing that's kind of really difficult to get built. Like, wow, I'm gonna email you, Sergio, later, and we're gonna talk more about that. I want to learn more. And so it's building those connections fundamentally, and staying in touch is doing that regional work. And then, of course, not ignoring the important role that the county plays in terms of regional coordination, and figuring out how to have them help us make the environment more welcoming and more accessible to more housing, especially when it comes, like I said, to that lower income stuff where we struggle as cities to go ahead and build because of the high cost of building low income housing and truly affordable housing. So keeping those county and, of course, your state, knowing your state reps and being in touch with them as those housing bills are coming, those are all critical things. And when you work together as a region, you become stronger, because when we build on El Camino, I want to know what's going on in Mountain View, what's going on in Santa Clara, and how the whole thing is going to interconnect, because that's going to determine a lot of the success of what we're trying to bring to bear along that corridor, so that when we look at this 10 years, 15 years in the future, we can say, oh no, we did a really good job building a connected network and putting housing where it really mattered, and it was really impactful. And we built that vibrant community to go along with the number of homes that we were able to actually construct in that period of time. So I'm really happy and just honored to be serving at the same time as so many very talented and passionate and smart people all across the region, and that's not lost on me. I never take it for granted. And of course, going ahead and looking forward, we're going to have elections coming up in 2022. So who's running? Who's going to be the next leader in another city that you can help mentor or support in some way, who's super pro housing and super smart and ready to go in there and lead? I want to talk to that person. So if that person is you and you're listening to this now, I'll drop my contact in the chat. I'd love to talk and like how to support you and think about how our cities can work together. So thank you for the question. I appreciate it. And it's a nice, inspiring note to end on, because it really makes the whole thing really worth it when you see things happening in other places, and you contribute to your city in that way as well.
Yeah, and I love the concept you ended on with the peer mentorship, because it's right. You know, we all while we're learning, we're all leaders, and we have something to offer our peers, and a support network is really critical. We all know that as we step into, you know, our next you know, opportunity or position or challenge, we know how critical support is. And so offering that support up to the next folks to get elected, I really appreciate you for that, Vice Mayor. So one of the questions we have is, it seems like a lot of folks in the disabled community who lost income due to the pandemic have not yet been able to get back to work. And they also are unable to access additional rental assistance now that Housing is Key is closing. So can you talk a little bit about what governments can do to protect these vulnerable persons from eviction in the near future due to their inability to pay rent? So is there someone who'd like to take that question?
I can take a stab at it.
Great, thank you.
I'm reading all of the questions from the public, and they're all hard. So good work on challenging this panel. So in short, there are no good answers to this question. The long-term solution is to build housing that is accessible to and affordable to all communities, and especially vulnerable communities, and folks with disabilities, both physical and developmental. Short-term, one of the more effective solutions that local governments have been using, especially during the pandemic, is rental assistance, rent relief. The city of Mountain View pumped over $4 million, predominantly from federal CDBG funding, but also some local funds as well to keep people housed during the pandemic. There really were no other options, right? This was before, so it started off before the formal eviction moratorium went into effect. And we knew we had to take action because the government shut down the economy. So people were not making, didn't have an income, but still had to pay the rent. So before the eviction moratorium was implemented, the only way to do that realistically was to help people pay their rent with public funds. And that's a model that I think we should sustain even beyond the pandemic, because there will always be people who have financial impacts, right? An unforeseen medical condition or job loss, something along those lines. So that's an important strategy that I think will remain in the toolbox of local governments and could apply in cases like this as well.
And I'll just add briefly to say that this question really illustrates one of the challenges that we face in Campbell, is that not only are we a much smaller city, but unlike some of my colleagues in other cities, we don't have a Google or an Apple, with those kinds of large employers to fund our tax base. So it's oftentimes partnerships with the county, and personal relationships go a long way there. As well, both in terms of my relationships and at the staff level. But I'll also say that I'm really excited that we're looking at ways, it's ongoing, staff is coming back with some suggestions on ways that we can use our ARPA funds to directly aid the community. And that we're going to be exploring more ideas for this soon, and for affordable housing in an upcoming special meeting. So excited to be part of that as well.
And I'll just say real quick, something that Sunny was recently proposed as a policy for Sunnyvale by one of my colleagues that I support very strongly, and would address this in a long-term way, as we would have to rank and study it and go through the process, is having a universal basic income. And that's something the city can do, and you can put that together through state grants. And also, you can go through those private sector contributions as well. And we have Sunnyvale Community Services, which is excited to partner and then identify and implement the people who would be getting those checks. So we're going to go through that process. But I think thinking about it, that this is something that has always been a problem, will be a problem until we address it. The pandemic just made it way more visible and way more immediate. So that's how we know we need to take bold, progressive action to go ahead and make sure that not only are we supporting people right now with our ARPA funds and working with organizations like Sunnyvale Community Service, who are helping folks out with their rent and their bills and food, but also thinking, okay, as a city, could we do a universal basic income? Because when people are given money to spend in the way that they see fit, they spend it in the way that they see fit, and it helps them more than other forms of assistance. So I'm excited to continue that conversation in my city and encourage other cities to think about it too, is that something that would be a fit for your community to support individuals in crisis now and in the future.
So I have one more question that I think we may get an opportunity to hear from a couple of you on, and that is, what is your take on the general principle of increasing home ownership? How can we help families build wealth? So I hear you, Vice Mayor, talking about universal basic income, but anyone want to comment really quickly on home ownership strategies?
I mean, I think one of the ways to do this responsibly is to make sure that as cities, in terms of what we can control, is that we're missing that we're building housing at all income levels. That's something that we're really taking a hard look at in this housing element process, to make sure that we aren't just reaching the highest levels. So I think in terms of what we can do now, that's certainly important. And especially for addressing the gap that we often see between different communities, particularly communities of color, and the home ownership gap that then turns into a wealth gap. but a lot of times I'll just, I'll end with a cautionary note on that, which is that a lot of what led into the issues that I faced, or that my family faced when I was growing up, was a lot of subprime mortgages that really built off federal legislation that helped support some of those programs, probably with good intentions to support communities of color, but that if we're not careful, turn into predatory capitalism that unfairly and disproportionately has destroyed a lot of wealth in those communities. So we really have to be targeted and go about this in a smart way, or it can have some unintended consequences.
Great, thank you. If no one else has anything to add to that point, I just want to thank our panelists. This was a really great, robust, vibrant conversation. I appreciate your transparency and sharing what you're working on in your community. So thank you so much. And I'll turn it back over to Todd.
Well, guys, that was amazing. Thank you all so much. Regina, it is a pleasure to meet you. I think this is the first time we've met, but we have a long existing relationship with your organization, and I look forward to continuing to partner and to get to work, hand in glove with you moving forward also. And I just have to tell you, I was sitting here listening, and it just strikes me so much as how, I just sit here and I'm so optimistic about the future of the Bay Area and on housing when I'm thinking, you guys are all amazing. I'm going to use the word young, but you're young leaders, but I don't want to undermine, that doesn't minimize. It's amazing that you guys are such strong, young elected leaders on this front. And I'm just so more and more confident with people like you leading the way that my children, when they come back from school, will have a place to live that's not my basement, which is what I really, really want, because I don't want them living with me, to be very, very clear. So anyway, again, Alysa, Sergio, Lucas, we really appreciate the partnership that we have with all of you as an organization, and anything that we can do to be helpful forwarding your policy goals, of course, be in touch with us on a regular basis. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.